A guy started a weight loss clinic in 2023 with $20,000 and one employee, his own brother. 2 years later, that business did $401 million in sales, and it's on track to do $1.8 billion this year. That's not a typo, and it's not an outlier fantasy. It's what happens when a chronic medical condition that affects 40% of American adults collides with a drug so effective that people are willing to pay for it entirely out of their own pocket. No insurance required. Okay, so you want to own a weight loss clinic. Patients showing up desperate for a solution that finally works. A recurring monthly relationship instead of a one-time sale. Margins that would make most doctors jealous. Here's what that picture doesn't show you. A huge share of this industry's early explosive growth was built on a temporary legal loophole tied to a drug shortage, one that the FDA has already started closing. A patient acquisition cost war so intense that some clinics are spending more to win a customer than they'll earn from that customer's first several months combined. And 2/3 of primary care physicians surveyed say this exact business model puts patients at risk, a credibility problem that could reshape the entire industry overnight if regulators start listening. Owning a weight loss clinic right now looks like one of the fastest ways to build serious wealth in American healthcare. It's also sitting on legal and reputational ground that's shifting under it in real time. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why, and what separates the operators who will still be standing in 5 years from the ones riding a boom that's already showing cracks. Before the numbers, a fast note on the shape of this industry, because it splits cleanly into two models with very different economics. There's the telehealth first clinic, built entirely online, prescribing through video or asynchronous consultations and shipping medication through partner pharmacies, the model behind the industry's biggest breakout successes. And there's the in-person medical clinic, a physical location offering consultations, injections, and monitoring face-to-face, generally slower to scale, but able to charge a premium for the kind of hands-on care telehealth can't replicate. This script covers both, because the startup economics and the risks facing each are different enough to matter. The startup cost, and it's genuinely one of the lowest barriers to entry we've covered on this channel. A lean telehealth first clinic can launch for around $10,000 in one-time setup costs, with monthly operating budgets starting under $1,000 and scaling to roughly $5,000 as you grow. Because the platform, prescribing network, and pharmacy partnerships that used to require building from scratch can now be licensed through existing telehealth infrastructure providers. A fully in-person clinic with a physical space, in-house staff, equipment, and full state licensing runs considerably higher, somewhere between $50,000 and $150,000 or more, to get the doors open. That gap, 15 times cheaper to launch online than in person, is exactly why the telehealth model has produced this industry's most explosive growth stories. The revenue model, and here's where the numbers get genuinely remarkable. This is a cash pay business almost by default, because insurance coverage for weight management remains limited, which means clinics set their own pricing without fighting an insurer over reimbursement rates. A first consultation typically runs $200 to $500, covering a health assessment and treatment plan, and because GLP-1 treatment requires ongoing monthly monitoring and prescription renewal, every patient converts into a recurring relationship rather than a single transaction. A modest, part-time operation can realistically generate around $250,000 a year at roughly 80% profit margins, an extraordinary number for any small business. A fully built-out clinic commonly surpasses $1 million in annual revenue while maintaining margins above 50%. And the demand driving all of this is not subtle. The U.S. GLP-1 market crossed roughly 19 million patients in early 2026, with a total addressable market north of $100 billion, and forecasts project more than 55 million Americans on anti-obesity treatments by 2035. Eli Lilly's tirzepatide products alone generated approximately $36.5 billion in revenue in 2025. becoming the best-selling drug in the world by the third quarter of that year. This is, by almost any measure, one of the fastest-growing consumer healthcare categories in modern history, and the clinics positioned in front of that demand curve are capturing genuinely extraordinary economics. Now here's the part of this story almost nobody talks about outside the industry itself. And it's the risk that should make anyone considering this business pay very close attention. A significant share of the early telehealth weight loss boom was built specifically on compounded semaglutide and tirzepatide, cheaper, non-brand name versions of these drugs that licensed compounding pharmacies were temporarily allowed to produce under federal law, but only while the brand name versions remained on the FDA's official drug shortage list. That compounding pathway was never meant to be permanent. It existed specifically as a stopgap while manufacturers caught up with demand. And in February 2025, the FDA declared the semaglutide shortage officially resolved, which under the law means compounding pharmacies are supposed to stop producing the cheaper compounded version of that specific drug entirely. For any clinic that built its pricing model, its patient acquisition strategy, and its entire cost advantage around offering compounded semaglutide at a fraction of the brand name price, that regulatory shift didn't just raise costs, it potentially eliminated an entire product line overnight. Tirzepatide's compounding pathway has followed a separate, still evolving timeline, which means the ground here hasn't fully settled and could shift again with very little warning. Layer a second pressure on top of that, the brand manufacturers themselves are now fighting directly for the price-sensitive cash-pay patient this entire telehealth industry was built to serve. Novo Nordisk announced a direct-to-consumer cash price of $199 for lower doses of Ozempic and Wegovy, sold straight through the manufacturer's own pharmacy rather than through a telehealth middleman. When the company that actually makes the drug starts competing on price directly with the clinics built to prescribe it. Every telehealth operator whose competitive edge was "we can get you this medication for less" suddenly has a much harder sell to make, from a company with infinitely more brand trust and a direct supply chain no compounding pharmacy will ever match. And there's a third, quieter risk sitting underneath both of those, a genuine credibility problem with the medical establishment itself. A 2025 survey of over 2,000 U.S. primary care physicians found that 67% believe these virtual weight loss platforms may put patients at risk, and more than half said they actively caution their own patients against using them, citing concerns about overprescribing and a lack of continuity of care. Consider the scale mismatch driving that skepticism. There are fewer than 100 physicians in the entire United States who have completed a formal fellowship in obesity medicine and are actively practicing, prescribing a medication now being taken by 19 million people and counting. The math simply doesn't allow for every GLP-1 prescription in America to come from a genuine specialist, which is exactly the gap telehealth platforms have filled, and exactly the gap critics point to when they use the phrase pill mill to describe parts of this industry. Here's the proof of just how explosive the upside can be when none of that catches up with you yet. Medvi, a telehealth GLP-1 platform, was built in 2023 by a founder and his brother, the company's only 2 employees at launch. Using roughly $20,000 in starting capital and AI tools to handle the website, advertising, customer service, and analytics almost entirely without additional hires. The company connects patients to licensed doctors and pharmacy partners for GLP-1 prescriptions, operating within the same legal telehealth framework used by other prescription platforms. By 2025, Medvi had generated $401 million in sales. It's currently on track for $1.8 billion this year. That trajectory, from $20,000 to 9 figures in under 2 years, is precisely the kind of story pulling new operators into this space by the thousands right now. And it's genuinely, verifiably real. It's also happening at the absolute peak of a boom that's already showing the exact regulatory and competitive cracks we just walked through. So who actually wins in this business over the next several years, once the early boom advantages start narrowing? almost never the operator whose entire pitch depended on cheap compounded medication as a permanent price advantage. That ground is actively shifting beneath the entire industry right now. The clinics built to last are the ones treating medication access as one part of a broader service, genuine clinical oversight, nutrition support, and long-term patient relationships, rather than a single low-price hook that a drug manufacturer's own direct-to-consumer pricing can undercut at will. Scale matters enormously here too. Platforms like Medv that reached massive patient volume early can absorb marketing costs, negotiate better pharmacy and prescriber partnerships, and build genuine brand trust in a way a small, newly launched telehealth clinic simply cannot replicate, starting from zero in 2026, competing against operators who already have millions of existing patients and years of acquired trust. Let's put real numbers next to two scenarios for a mid-sized telehealth clinic doing roughly 2,000 active patients. The good year: strong organic growth, a diversified prescribing mix not overly dependent on compounded medication, and steady patient retention through genuine clinical support. Average monthly revenue per patient across consultations and ongoing care reaches roughly $150, generating $300,000 a month, $3.6 million a year. At a healthy 60% margin after pharmacy partnerships, staffing, and platform costs, net profit for the year reaches roughly $2.1 million. An extraordinary result for a business that started with a fraction of that in capital. The bad year, the compounding pathway for your core medication, closes entirely following further FDA action, forcing an abrupt shift to brand name only prescribing at a much higher cost basis. Right as Novo Nordisk direct cash pay pricing peels away your most price-sensitive patients who no longer need a middleman. Patient volume drops by a third as acquisition costs spike in an increasingly crowded, skeptical market, and your margin compresses to 30% as medication costs rise faster than you can pass them on without losing more patients. Revenue falls to $2.4 million, and at the lower margin, net profit for the year drops to roughly $720,000. Still genuinely profitable, but a 66% collapse from the year before on a business that looked nearly identical on paper 12 months earlier. The swing between those 2 years is close to $1.4 million, and none of it came from patients losing interest in the underlying product. It came from the exact regulatory and competitive ground shifts already actively happening in this industry right now, not hypothetical future risks. So, does owning a weight loss clinic make sense? The honest answer is that the underlying demand is about as real and durable as anything in modern healthcare. A genuinely effective treatment for a condition affecting nearly half the country, with patients willing to pay for it directly out of pocket. But the specific version of this business that produced the most jaw-dropping success stories over the last 2 years, cheap compounded medication, minimal clinical oversight, aggressive online acquisition, is the exact version currently colliding with FDA enforcement, manufacturer price competition, and a skeptical medical establishment all at once. The operators who build something durable here are the ones treating this as a genuine long-term healthcare business rather than a short-term arbitrage on a temporary drug shortage loophole, investing in real clinical infrastructure and patient relationships that don't evaporate the moment a compounding exemption expires. The fantasy of turning $20,000 into a billion-dollar business is real, and it has already happened at least once, verifiably. The ground it happened on is shifting fast enough that the same playbook run today faces risks that simply didn't exist when that first story began, and the owners who last are the ones who understood, before they launched, that they weren't really in the business of selling a medication. They were in the business of building trust in an industry that a huge share of the medical establishment is actively watching for the exact moment it stops deserving it.